My name's Trina Walsh. I'm 63 years old now, born and raised in Humboldt County, and I've lived in Rio Dell most of my life. I'm not a hunter, I'm not into Bigfoot or any of that weird Facebook group stuff, and up until my encounter with this werewolf-like creature, the scariest thing I'd seen at night was a drunk neighbor trying to parallel park. I'm saying that up front because I know how this all sounds when you hear it cold. If someone else told me what I'm about to tell you, I'd probably ask how much they'd had to drink. But I know what I saw in my yard that night in 1994. I know what it did to my dog, and I remember exactly what it looked like under that porch light, even if I wish I didn't. Back then, my husband Mike and I were renting a little house in the woods a few miles outside of Rio Dell, at the end of a narrow gravel road. I loved it out there. Giant redwoods on all sides, ferns and salal underneath, and just enough space between the trunks to let the afternoon light through in long orange stripes. We had a couple of neighbors within a radius of about a mile, but you couldn't see their houses from the porch, just the distant glow of their windows through the trees at night. Behind our fence, the land dropped off into thicker timber and brush that ran down toward the river. In the daytime, it looked peaceful. At night, it turned into a black wall. The house itself was one of those tired little post-war boxes, 2 bedrooms, sagging front porch, carport instead of a garage. The landlord kept the roof patched and the plumbing working, but that was about it. We had a decent-sized backyard for the dog, fenced on 3 sides with 4-foot wood panels. Mike was my high school sweetheart, had served in the Navy for 4 years, then came back to town. Back then, he worked swing shift at a parts warehouse down toward Fortuna, so his schedule was all over the place, either home sleeping during the day or rolling in around midnight, depending on the week. We fought sometimes about stupid things, but he was good with the dog, and he took care of the basic man stuff around the house, changing light bulbs, that sort of thing. Our dog, Daisy, was a yellow lab mix we'd picked up from a shelter in Sacramento. 80 pounds, good-natured, absolutely convinced she was a lapdog. She demanded pats from delivery drivers, joggers, and the mailman, and if you actually stepped into the yard, she'd try to lick you to death. Labs aren't exactly guard dogs, but she did let us know if anyone was moving around outside. The night all this happened was in late fall 1994. I'm not going to pretend I remember the exact date off the top of my head, but it was after Halloween and before Thanksgiving. We already had the first real rains, the kind that knock the dust down and make everything smell like wet leaves and asphalt. The kind of weather where the yard turns muddy and you track little boot prints through the kitchen if you're not careful. Mike was on a late shift that week, so it was just Daisy and me in the house. I worked days at a dental office in Fortuna, so by the time I got home, I was usually wiped out. My routine was pretty simple. Feed the dog, make something quick for dinner, shower, then sit on the couch under a blanket and flip through channels until I landed on whatever crime show was on. There had been some weirdness in the weeks leading up to that night, but nothing you'd call the cops about. Mostly just small things I brushed off. Trash cans knocked over at the side of the house when the lid had been latched. I assumed raccoons. Daisy getting spooked in the bedroom around 2 in the morning, barking and growling at the window like she could see something I couldn't. Again, I blamed raccoons, or maybe a stray cat. One morning, I found the back gate standing wide open, even though I was sure I'd latched it the night before. Nothing outside the house had been touched, so I told myself it must have been the wind, or that I'd been distracted and never closed it properly. The only thing that really stuck with me was the feeling you get sometimes when you walk from the car to the front door after dark, that prickling between your shoulder blades like someone's watching you. I'd step onto the porch, fumble with my keys, and feel like there were eyes on the back of my neck from the direction of the greenbelt. Then I'd get the door open, flip on the lights, and the feeling would vanish. You tell yourself it's just your imagination. A couple of neighbors had their own stories. Mrs. Delgado, who lived a half-mile down the road, said something had gotten into her chicken coop one night and killed 3 birds, made a giant mess in there, and left a trail of half-eaten remains all through her backyard. She blamed feral dogs. A guy who lived at the place across from us, where the road bends, swore a huge coyote had run through his yard one morning before dawn. jumping his 4-foot chain-link fence like it was nothing. Everyone had seen the usual local wildlife, so no one was particularly concerned. We never saw tracks that were out of place. The soil in our yard was a mix of grass and hard-packed dirt, and if anything did leave a mark, it usually blurred into nothing after a day of rain. A couple of times, I thought I saw prints by the back fence, but they were smudged. A bit big for a dog, but not clear enough to photograph or measure. At the time, I didn't think to. Why would I? It was probably just Daisy doing her zoomies. Looking back, I think that whatever I saw later had already been moving through that strip of timber for a while, using the properties as a kind of corridor down toward the river. It knew which houses had dogs, who left their trash out, who had motion lights, and who didn't. That's how it felt afterward, like we weren't dealing with a random wild animal, but with something that had been paying attention. The day of the incident was normal. Work was work. Cleanings, fillings, small talk with patients about their kids and the weather. I drove home in the dark, like always, took the back way through Scotia to avoid some roadwork, and pulled into the driveway a little after 6. It was already fully dark by then. The air had that cold, damp edge you get near the river, and I remember seeing my breath when I got out of the car. I let Daisy out to pee while I brought in the mail and dropped my purse on the table. The porch light only covered part of the yard, so she vanished into the shadows toward the back fence like she always did, nose down, tail wagging. Inside, I kicked off my shoes, turned on the TV for background noise, and started dinner. I could hear Daisy barking once or twice outside, short, sharp barks that usually meant she'd smelled a raccoon or heard someone walking by on the access road. Nothing unusual. Around 8, the kitchen phone rang. It was Mike calling from the warehouse break room to let me know he was running late on his last break and probably wouldn't be home until sometime after midnight. By 9, I was in my usual spot on the couch, blanket over my legs, remote in hand. Daisy was inside, stretched out on the rug with her head on my foot, snoring softly. Rain tapped on the windows off and on, nothing heavy. It was the kind of night where the world feels far away, and you could almost forget about the weird noises and open gates. I remember thinking, as I got up to take a shower around 10, that it was one of those rare evenings where everything felt settled. No late-night drama from the neighbors, no sirens on the highway, no power flickers. Just a quiet, damp little town and my sleepy dog following me down the hall, toenails clicking on the laminate. That's what makes what happened later so hard to reconcile in my mind. It went from everyday normal to an absolute nightmare in less than a minute. I'm telling you all these details because I want you to understand. There was nothing off about that night until the moment Daisy started screaming. That was the sound that changed everything. Not barking, not growling, screaming. And by the time I reached the back door and flipped on the porch light, whatever had come out of those woods wasn't just sniffing around the fence anymore. The scream hit me halfway down the hallway. 1 second, I was in the bedroom, pulling my hair up and digging through a drawer for clean pajamas. The next, Daisy let out a sound I had never heard from her in 8 years of owning that dog, like she'd just been stabbed. I dropped what I was holding and ran. The house isn't big, but in that moment, the distance from the bedroom to the back door felt like a football field. I remember my socks sliding on the laminate, my shoulder clipping the door frame, and my hand slapping at the light switch in the living room. The porch light was on a separate switch by the door. I hit that too, hard enough to sting my palm. Daisy screamed again, then her voice cut off into this horrible, choked yelping. When I yanked the curtain aside and looked through the glass of the back door, for a split second, my brain refused to organize what I was seeing. It was all motion and angles and color. Pale fur, dark fur, mud, wood fence, teeth. Then it snapped into place. Daisy was on her side in the middle of the yard, kicking and twisting, her front paws digging furrows in the wet grass where she'd been dragged. The thing had her by the hind legs and was hauling her backwards toward the fence. I could see her collar, her head thrown sideways, the whites of her eyes, and that pain-filled, panicked face. One of those sights you know. Even as you're seeing it, you're never going to forget. But the back half of her body was buried in a mass of thick limbs and dark fur pressed up against her. At first, I thought it was a bear. That's what my brain reached for. Big, dark, upright. Something that had just come over the fence and grabbed her, but it wasn't moving like a bear. It didn't have that round, heavy way of throwing its weight around, or that side-to-side sway in the shoulders. This thing was all lines and tendons, like everything in it was wound tight, built for quick bursts and hard hits, the way a coil looks right before you let it snap. I yanked the door open without thinking. Cold air and the smell of wet dirt and some sort of rot hit me at the same time. Daisy's nails clawed at the ground, scrabbling for anything. She was making this awful gargling noise now, not even a yelp, just trying to breathe and scream at the same time. I heard myself screaming at it, as loud as my throat would go, telling it to get off her. The thing stopped. It didn't flinch like a normal animal that's been caught. It didn't jump or whirl. It just paused, the way a person does when someone says their name. Then it turned its head and looked at me. Still close enough to catch some of the porch light, I saw the side of its face first. The muzzle was too short for how wide the jaws were, like somebody had taken a bear's snout and shoved it back into the skull. The forehead above it was flatter than it should have been, almost blocky, with the fur lying in odd ridges. None of it looked like it fit together right. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't a bear. Its eyes caught the light and flashed, but not like a cat or a dog. The reflection was there, sure, but behind it there was something else. Awareness. Not just light, sound, movement, but a kind of focus that pinned me to the spot. It was hunched over Daisy on 2 legs, not 4, knees bent and feet planted wide like it was trying to remember how to balance. Even hunched like that, the sheer size of it shocked me. It still stood at least 2 feet taller than me at the shoulders, and I'm not a small woman. The top of our 4-foot fence barely came to its hip. The upper limbs weren't straight like a bear's front legs. They had an extra bend in them, and the forearms looked too long, with a joint closer to where a human wrist would be. The whole thing shifting and adjusting in a way that didn't look steady at all. What really broke me was the hand. The one clamped over Daisy's ribcage was huge and clumsy looking, the fingers too thick and too long, but still looked clearly human. I could see those fingers flex and shift as Daisy twisted. It was holding her down the way you'd pin a struggling person. I don't remember deciding to step off the porch, but suddenly the wet boards were under my bare feet, and I was halfway to the edge, still yelling, voice cracking. That was when the real fear hit. Not the little tingle you get walking to your car at night, but the deep, cold kind that starts low in your stomach and crawls up your spine. Every part of me was screaming to get back inside and slam the door, but Daisy was out there, and there was no way I was going to stand in the kitchen and listen to her die. The thing watched me approach, head tilted just a hair, like it was sizing up the situation, like it had all the time in the world. Daisy gave one more strangled yelp, then her body went limp. For a second I was sure I'd just watched her die in front of me, and my knees almost went out from under me right there on the porch. That was when I heard the truck. Gravel popped out front, then the familiar low rumble of Mike's old Chevy rolling to a stop. Headlights swung through the trees and splashed over the side of the house. I hadn't even heard him come up the road. I found out later he'd gotten off a little early and came straight home because it had started to pour. The creature must have heard it too. Its ears flicked toward the sound, then back to me. For a moment, it looked like it was going to drag Daisy into the woods. It shifted its weight, and I saw more of its body. Long torso, hips a bit too narrow for how big the shoulders were, back legs bent like a dog's, but much thicker, like there was more muscle packed into them than there should have been. I heard Mike shout my name from the front door, then his boots pounding through the house, his voice rising in confusion as he realized that neither Daisy nor I were coming to greet him. I was shouting back at him without even thinking, trying to get the words out that something was in the yard and that it had killed Daisy. For a few heartbeats after the truck shut off, there was this strange pocket of quiet. No engine noise, no yelling, just the rain that thing standing over her with its heavy, ragged breathing. Then Mike was suddenly at my shoulder on the porch, work jacket half-zipped, hair still damp from the rain, taking in the horrific scene in the yard in one hard look. His hand went straight to his waist. he'd carried since getting out of the service, Glock 19 in an inside-the-waistband holster, and all those years of drilling must have kicked in at once, because he had it out and up in no time. I'd rolled my eyes at that gun more than once. Since that moment, I've been nothing but grateful for it. The creature didn't move at all. It was standing there, up on two legs, still clutching Daisy with that oversized hand, unwilling to give up its prey. Daisy hung half off the ground in front of it, completely limp. Mike let out a roar, angrier than I'd ever heard from him. A shout meant to pull its attention fully onto him. It gave him its full attention. Then he fired. The first shot was like someone slamming a metal door in my ear. The creature jerked sideways and let out a deep, heavy grunt. Some kind of spray came off its side, but from where I was standing, I couldn't tell if it was just rain and breath or if there was blood in it too. It didn't go down. Instead, it pivoted, almost too fast to track, half turning its body like it was going to bolt for the fence. Mike fired again. The second round hit somewhere above its left brow. I saw the impact clearly from the porch. Its head snapped back, and the whole body went over sideways, dropping Daisy out of its grip. It started flailing almost immediately, limbs kicking and clawing at the ground, so it was obvious the hit wasn't lethal. It also started screaming now. The sound it made was nothing like the noises that had come out of Daisy a few moments earlier. Her screams still sounded like a dog in pain, awful but familiar in a way your brain can file. This was different. It was too loud, too deep, and too high at the same time, like several sounds stacked on top of each other. It didn't sound like it belonged in a backyard or anywhere in this world. Ungodly is the only word I have for it. Even while it was making that noise, it was already trying to get up again. It rolled onto its stomach, got its front limbs under it, and pushed itself up on all fours, then started moving away from us toward the back fence in an awkward, limping run. With Daisy out of the way, Mike fired 3 more rounds in quick succession. At least one of those hits landed somewhere in the back half of its body. I saw the fur jump just as it reached the fence, but it still managed to launch itself over the boards. He stopped shooting then, but kept the gun pointed at the line of trees in case it came back. Branches snapped and thrashed as it plowed through the brush. We could hear it for maybe 3 seconds. Heavy, frantic impacts, the kind of chaotic crashing you'd expect from a panicked animal. Then there was a strangled, coughing howl from somewhere down the slope, and after that, nothing but rain and our own breathing. As soon as it was out of sight, I went for Daisy. I don't remember deciding to move. 1 second I was on the porch, the next I was off it and in the yard, slipping in the wet grass as I ran to where she'd fallen. Mike came right behind me but stayed focused on the woods, Glock still up, eyes never leaving the tree line in case the thing doubled back. Up close, I was braced for the worst. From the door, she had looked completely limp, and for a second, I was scared I was about to put my hands on a dead dog. Her fur along her back and across her belly was slicked dark, with deep, bloody gouges and claw marks raked through the skin where it had grabbed and dragged her. One of her hind legs was clearly broken, twisted out away from her body at the hip like it had been yanked straight up and wrenched out of line. But when I touched her, I felt her chest moving in short, shallow breaths, and her eyes were open, rolling around, trying to find me. "Hey, puppy," I said, my voice shaking. "Hey, it's okay, it's okay. We've got you." She tried to lick my hand and let out a soft whine. Mike backed up toward us, still watching the fence, gun at low ready. "I don't see it," he said. "It's gone. We need to get her to the vet, now." The drive into town is a blur in my memory, but certain pieces are fixed. I remember the way the cab smelled like wet dog and iron, Daisy's blood drying on the blanket under my hands. I remember watching her chest the whole time instead of the road, counting the rise and fall in short, uneven breaths, and waiting for one that didn't come. Mike pulled right up to the door, and someone met us with a gurney before the engine was even off. A tech in scrubs took one look at Daisy and waved us inside without making us fill anything out first. We lifted her together, trying to keep the broken leg as still as possible. She yelped once when we shifted her hips onto the gurney, then went back to that open-mouthed panting. They rolled her into an exam room, and we trailed after them until someone put a hand up and told us politely but firmly to wait just outside. I could see through the glass panel in the door. Blue gloves, clippers, gauze, the vet's hands moving fast but controlled. They had an IV in Daisy within a minute, white tape on her front leg, and an oxygen mask over her muzzle. When the vet finally came out to talk to us, I realized I'd been standing in the same spot for long enough that my legs had gone stiff. She was in her 50s, maybe, hair pulled back, tired eyes that still looked sharp. Her scrub top had fresh blood on it that I knew wasn't from whatever she'd been doing before we arrived. She started with the facts. Daisy's leg was definitely broken near the hip. The way the joint had shifted and the way the muscle sat around it, she said. It looked more like it had been wrenched out of alignment by force than from a clean impact or a car strike. The gouges along her back and stomach were deep in places, but hadn't gone clean through the abdominal wall. A few of them would need drains. None of her organs looked punctured. There was some concern about internal bleeding around the hip, but at that moment, she was not in immediate danger of crashing. In plain terms, she was hurt badly, but she wasn't critical. They were going to keep her, stabilize her, do proper imaging once she was fully sedated, and then decide how to handle the leg long-term. Surgery was likely. Time in a crate and months of rehab were almost guaranteed, but the vet said she gave her good odds of making it. It took a second for that to land. I'd spent the entire drive braced for the words, "We did what we could," and a recommendation about cremation. Hearing instead that there was a plan and that my dog had a decent chance of walking out of there felt like someone had let air back into my lungs. Once she'd covered that, the vet's tone shifted from clinical to confused. She kept going back to the pattern of the injuries. The claw marks and gouges were obvious, long parallel lines, deep in some spots, superficial in others. The broken hip and leg lined up with something big, hauling her up and putting a lot of weight or leverage on that one limb. What she didn't see, and said so more than once, were bite marks. She asked what had gotten into the yard. At first I didn't answer. My brain just kind of stalled out. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. All I could think of was Daisy lying on the blanket and the way that hand had been wrapped around her ribs. I must have looked worse than I realized, because Mike stepped in. He gave her the cleaned-up version. Big animal, on two legs, came over the fence or out of the trees. Dark fur, wrong-shaped head, long arms with hands instead of paws. He mentioned that he'd fired several rounds from the Glock at it and watched it climb or jump back over the fence and run into the trees. He mentioned the part where he'd watched a round hit just above its left eye and knock it over, and added that the bullet must have glanced off the skull instead of going in, which explained why it was able to get up again. He chalked that up as bad luck and cursed himself for not being able to put the thing down right then and there. The vet listened without interrupting, her expression going from puzzled to something close to blank. When Mike finished, she didn't immediately offer a theory. Instead, she asked a few follow-up questions, trying to fit what we were saying into something familiar. Was there any chance it was a bear? A mountain lion? A big dog from one of the neighboring properties? Had Daisy ever tangled with another dog before? We answered as best we could. No, it hadn't moved like a bear. No, we hadn't seen any sign of a big cat. No typical raking, no grab-and-bite pattern around the neck. The claw spacing didn't look right for anything, and there were no deep punctures from canine teeth around the throat or shoulder. Just those long, raking cuts and the damage to the leg and hip. None of it made sense when you laid it out in a clean, bright exam room under fluorescent lights. I could see it in her face. The description didn't fit anything she'd seen come through her doors in 30 years. She kept glancing back through the glass at Daisy on the table, as if the body would suddenly rearrange itself into a more logical set of injuries. In the end, she wrote something neutral in the chart. Large, unknown animal, possibly a bear or other large predator. She said he would be passing the case on to the regular daytime vet in the morning with a full note, and that we should expect to get a call once they had the x-rays and blood work. For the moment, there wasn't anything more we could do there. Daisy was sedated, on fluids and pain meds. They were going to keep her at least overnight, probably longer. They needed us to sign consent forms and leave a deposit, then go home and wait. We didn't talk much on the drive back. I think we were both trying to process different pieces of the same mess, me replaying the backyard over and over, Mike trying to figure out what the creature was and how to deal with it. It wasn't until we were back at the house, standing in the kitchen with the porch light still on, that he said what he was going to do. In plain terms, he wasn't going to wait for it to recover and come back. As far as he was concerned, something that big and that bold, close to houses and trying to drag off a pet, wasn't going to stop there. The world, or at least our little corner of it, needed to be rid of that thing. I tried to talk him out of it. I'd just watched it take half a magazine and still clear a fence. I'd seen the size of it and the way it moved. The thought of him going out into those woods, even with a gun and his training, made my stomach turn. I told him flat out I didn't want him to go, but his mind was already made up. You could see it in the way his face shut down into that same expression he'd had in the truck, the one I'd seen a couple of times when something had gone wrong at work, and he'd shifted into problem-solving mode. He said he couldn't live with himself if he just sat around and waited for that thing to come back for somebody else's dog or somebody's kid. Sitting and doing nothing wasn't in him. What follows is all secondhand from what he has told me later. I wasn't there. He made that part non-negotiable. When I said I was coming with him if he was going back out, he shut it down immediately and said he wasn't about to drag me into the same woods where that thing roamed around freely. I could either stay home or go stay with a friend in town. Either way, he said, I was not going on that hunt. That night, he got on the phone. First call was to the sheriff, Andrash. They'd gone to school together, and the man trusted Mike's judgment more than most. The second call was to one of the local hunters Mike sometimes went out with in deer season, a guy who knew those ridges and draws better than anyone else. Mike laid it out for them as best he could. What we'd seen, what Daisy looked like, how many rounds he'd put into the thing, and where he thought he'd hit it. Early the next morning, just after first light, they met at our place. I remember 3 trucks in the driveway, men standing in a loose circle by the tailgate with coffee and paper cups and rifles laid out on a blanket. Sheriff Marco had brought a shotgun and a bolt action he used for hogs. The hunter, Dave, had a .30-06 and a pack with more gear than I could name. Mike had his Glock and a borrowed rifle of his own. They talked quietly for a while, going over the map spread out on the tailgate, tracing the direction the thing had run, and figuring out which logging roads and game trails it would have likely used. They started with the blood. There was enough of it in the grass by the fence and on the broken boards that even a city person could have followed the first 100 yards. After that, according to Mike, it turned into more of a tracking job. Drops on leaves, a smear on a low-hanging limb where it had brushed through, a half-print in a patch of softer ground that looked more like a bare heel than a paw. They followed that trail deeper into the forest, away from the river and up into rougher country. A few hours in, they found a cabin. Calling it a cabin might be generous. From what Mike described, it was more like the shell of an old logger's shack that had lost a fight with a winter storm 30 years earlier. Half the roof was caved in, and one wall had slumped inward. Moss and ferns had grown up over the rotten boards, but somebody, or something, had been using what was left as shelter. Inside, they found what he could only describe as a nest. Not like an animal den dug into the dirt, but a sort of low, hollow spot piled up with rubbish. Old blankets, shredded tarps, bits of foam and fabric, plastic bags, even torn pieces of clothing. All of it matted down into a kind of bed against the back wall, out of the wind and mostly out of sight from the door. There were bones, too, in the corners. Deer, mostly, but a couple he wasn't sure about. The creature wasn't there when they went in. For a minute, they thought maybe it had crawled off somewhere else to die. The air inside the cabin smelled like old mold, animal, and something sour underneath it all. They checked the corners, the space under the broken bunks, and the gap where the chimney used to be. Nothing. It was outside, in the trees, waiting. The way Mike told it, Dave, the hunter, stepped out first to circle around and check the brush behind the cabin. The sheriff was a few steps behind him, angling off to one side. Mike hung back near the doorway, covering the opposite angle. They were spread just far enough apart that none of them had a full view of the others, which is probably the only reason the thing didn't get all three of them at once. It hit Dave from the side. 1 second he was there, the next he was on the ground with a mass of dark fur and limbs on top of him, rolling and snarling. Mike said it moved faster than he'd expected, even after seeing it in our yard. There was no warning growl, no crashing, just a blur and the sound of air and weight hitting a body. The thing must have been up in a tree and then jumped down on top of Dave. The hunter got an arm up between himself and its mouth, and that probably saved his life. He took a rake of claws along his shoulder and side that opened him up through the jacket, but didn't go as deep as they could have. The sheriff and Mike closed in from 2 angles, both firing as soon as they were sure they weren't going to hit their friend. Between the 2 of them, they put several rounds into it from a distance, then another 10 or so at close range. Sheriff Marco especially had trouble keeping himself in check and kept firing, even after it had stopped moving, and Mike would soon learn why. This time, it stayed down. He didn't go into detail about the exact sequence after that. Even months later, he'd get tight around the mouth if you pressed him on it. What he did say was that once they were sure it wasn't getting back up, all 3 of them moved in to get a look at it. That was the part that really traumatized him. Shooting it had been one thing. Seeing it up close was something else. He said it wasn't a normal animal of any kind he'd ever seen. Up close, in daylight, some of the features were clearly human. Around the eyes and the set of the cheekbones, the way the mouth sat in the face when it wasn't pulled back in a snarl. The hands, too, looked more human than not, even if they were oversized and twisted. The rest of it was all wrong. Limbs long and powerful, joints in the wrong places, bones that didn't seem to match the proportions of anything he'd learned about in school or the Navy. Everything was distorted, like someone had tried to build a person out of wolf parts and hadn't quite gotten the measurements right. Sheriff Marco, whose family came from somewhere in Eastern Europe, was the one who gave it a name. He called it a werewolf. He explained later on that his grandfather had used that word when telling old country stories about things that walked upright in the woods and shouldn't. Half-man, half-wolf figures that came out at night when people broke certain rules or wandered too far from the village. As a kid, he'd assumed it was just superstition, a way to scare children into staying close to home. Standing over the body in that clearing, he said the word came back to him all at once, along with the same tight, gut-level fear he'd felt listening to those stories in the dark. I looked it up several years later, when the internet made it easy to check that kind of thing. The word is Hungarian and literally comes out to something like blood wolf, which is their way of saying werewolf, a creature that walks like a man but hunts like a beast. That description lined up a little too well with what I had seen and what Mike had told me. The sheriff was deeply religious, and according to Mike, he was badly shaken by the sight of it. This wasn't something he wanted photographed, hauled into town, or turned into a news story. He said some things were better off never being seen or written down. He insisted he would come back with gas cans and take care of the body himself, that it needed to be burned, so there was nothing left for anyone to find or poke at. He told Mike and the hunter to head home, get cleaned up, and keep their mouths shut about the details. As far as any official paperwork would go, they dealt with a dangerous animal in the woods and put it down before it could hurt anyone else. That was it. So that's what they did. Mike came back to the house late that afternoon, looking 10 years older than he had the day before. He was scraped up from pushing through brush and had a dark smear on one sleeve that wasn't his. He told me that the thing in the woods wasn't going to be dragging any more dogs out of yards. It took him several days to open up and tell me about the hunt. But every time I asked him what it had really looked like, he just said it was worse up close and changed the subject. Daisy pulled through. It took surgery, a metal plate, and months of crate rest and short, careful walks on a leash, but she got her life back, just a little slower and stiffer on that back leg. We had another quiet 25 years in that stretch of woods, without so much as a strange track by the fence, and eventually moved up to Seattle to be closer to our kids once they were grown. In all that time, we never saw or heard anything like that creature again, and as far as I know, neither did anyone else in Humboldt County.